Origins and Odyssey was quite a controversial game that left the AC community divided due to the RPG direction Ubisoft took with the franchise. Many believe previous titles are what made Assassin's Creed a true Assassin's Creed game, but Ubisoft had to change the formula when Syndicate didn't sell really well, which led them to switch the formula entirely by making it an RPG, causing the community feeling disappointed while some approved with the direction they were heading. I was one of those Assassin's Creed fans that didn't approve of the RPG direction since I heavily grew up with the Ezio trilogy and I simply decided not to buy Origins or Odyssey simply for that reason. However, even if I voted not to support the direction they were heading with my wallet, Assassin's Creed Origins outsold Syndicate, which was a huge success for Ubisoft. With that success, they made Odyssey, which was by far the most criticized Assassin's Creed game in the franchise, but despite all of that, it still outsold Origins by a lot. I heard a lot of people who played and enjoyed Odyssey, and most of them mentioned it's a good game, it's just not a good Assassin's Creed game. But for me, Odyssey isn't just a bad Assassin's Creed game, it's just not an Assassin's Creed game. But now that time has passed, Ubisoft announced Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which I was hoping to at least change the formula back to their roots, but my expectations were destroyed when the leaks came out. I didn't feel disappointed, just underwhelming to say the least, but I decided to let my nostalgia aside and instead gave Ubisoft a chance. Who knows, maybe I'm just wrong and I'm just blinded by the elitists disguising themselves as true veteran fans of the franchise. So, I pre-ordered it, and once I played it on day one, I'm honestly surprised that I had a lot of fun playing this game, and I consider it my third favorite Assassin's Creed game in the franchise, and I'll still review this game in section by section like my last video, which I do not recommend watching it. Anyways, let's get on with the video. Despite me playing this game on base PS4, I did not raise my expectations for the game to look visually stunning, unlike other upcoming titles that push their game to look next-gen as possible. But if visual graphics have to be sacrificed in order to have an immersive gameplay experience, then Ubisoft managed to accomplish that. And surprisingly, I rarely had any frame rate drops throughout my playthrough. The only time it happens is when too many enemies are present while too much stuff is happening behind the background, but it did not last very long and only lasted for a few seconds. While as I mentioned the game doesn't look visually stunning on the PS4, it looks pretty good on current gen graphics, and England is a really beautiful place to explore. Walking around the dense city of London or Jorvik feels straight out of an E3 gameplay trailer, but what I find more visually stunning are the character designs and the clothing texture. The level of detail is absolutely great, as each Avor's cape has a different type of texture, which is pretty impressive as they don't seem like they are reskins. There are some odd moments where the clothing clips through the character. I didn't personally mind during the cutscene as they are quite small, but most noticeably when you wear the Mentor's robe, the clothes clips through the cape, which kinda makes it a pet peeve to look at. It could either be a bug or simply a flawed design of the outfit. While the map isn't groundbreaking as Tsushima's environment, like how the wind interacts with grass, trees, and clothing, it does look really good, and I really enjoy myself traversing around England either by horse or sailing through the river. Even though I'm not so familiar with England's historical locations other than London or the Stonehenge, it did left me curious to explore the world more, and I like how the Roman architecture seems ruined or abandoned as it gives a lot of depth or more history on the world. I did find myself using photo mode so often, and as I mentioned in my previous video, if the game makes me use photo mode frequently, they did an amazing job designing this map. I do have to point out that this game takes forever to load, and I expected that from buying this game on the base PS4. I don't really recommend playing this game only and exclusively on the current gen consoles, not because of visual performance or long loading screens, but just simply isn't designed to run in current gen consoles. Despite running decently well, I would much rather prefer to play this game on the PS5, if I had one. While character design have changed throughout the franchise, the facial expression are still expressive and does fit with the voice naturally, that I would say it's a somewhat improvement of Odyssey, but sometimes the lip syncing can be a hit or miss. Valhalla on the PS4 does look pretty nice if you don't really pay attention a lot to details in the environment like myself. Overall, I think the visual department gets an A+ in my book. I know a lot of people complain about how long it takes for a game to load. For me, I don't really care that much. While it is impressive that a game loads really quickly, I always utilize long loading screens to check my Twitter and DMs. The only issue I have is with an unnecessary loading where it fades to black for a few seconds later to later run this 10-second animation cutscene to later back again, fade to black, and takes half a minute to load again. But I rarely had that as far as I can remember, but at the end of the day, if you want a true visual performance, then I recommend playing this game on the PS5 or Xbox Series X. I have never played Origins or Odyssey, so I cannot say it feels the same as Valhalla combat system, but what I can say however is that I had a lot of fun with the combat, and it kinda changed my mind with the whole RPG direction Ubisoft has taken, as I now understand why it needed to change. I like how each weapons function differently and have really nice design to them, and throughout my playthrough I started with the two-handed axe, then a greatsword, later a hammer, and while I progressed through the side quests I got the Sword of Excalibur along with the ability to double wield heavy weapons to now dual wielding two great swords, which looks really badass on Eivor. I did play this game on hard mode, which at first it was kinda difficult to do combat, but later I started to get used to it. The impact of parrying enemies feels satisfying, and each hit at the enemy feels impactful and feels like you're doing damage to the enemy, even at higher levels. On presentation, it's really fun, however, I did find a lack of variety when it comes to animations, and it's kinda disappointing as an Assassin's Creed has one of the best animations in the series. As much as I dislike Syndicate, at least I give them credit for having amazing kill animation that makes you say, whoa, that's fucking cool. Assassin's Creed 3 with the brutal double counter kill is satisfying to watch, but in Valhalla it's the same animation over and over and over and over again, which becomes stale and repetitive. Don't get me wrong, I do find these animations cool and brutal, but I just want to see more variety when it comes to performing these animations. I want to feel like a badass Viking that can take out a group of 5 Anglo-Saxons, and Ubisoft had the tools and assets for that, and I wouldn't care if they reuse those assets from Assassin's Creed 3 and Syndicate. Like, the combat is there, and if they continue to do what the previous titles were good at, they could have done the best combat, at least in my opinion. I don't want to sound like I'm saying each setup should have their own unique animations. For instance, a left-handed axe and a right-handed greatsword should have at least 5 unique animations. I shouldn't get too far because it sounds like I'm going into nitpick territory. Abilities can be unlocked by searching for yellow icons scattered around the map or eliminating zealots and members of the Ancient Order, which are pretty nice to have and they are beneficial to have them in battle. However, they can be somewhat overpowered if you utilize them a lot. While I don't agree that this is a bad thing as other people mention, they are better to have them to deal with annoying boss battles like the zealots with heavy shields. Most of the critiques I've heard is, quote, abilities are press A to win, end quote. While it is somewhat true, it's not as unnecessarily easy as previous Assassin's Creed titles where the counter was the most overpowered move you have. Abilities cause adrenaline bars, which prevents you from using them frequently, and while abilities that can wipe out entire army of Anglo-Saxons, those abilities cause stamina, which leaves you vulnerable. On a base level, they are overpowered in the right way, but when it comes to boss battles, they are ridiculously overpowered.
Let me do the honor of breaking Ragnar's shield wall.
I hope you will. Stand back, warrior. And if Loki rules the day, you may have a chance. I am a fortress impenetrable.
The biggest criticism I've heard is that the difficulty is too easy when you're in mid-game, despite being on the highest difficulty. But this is something that Ubisoft has addressed from the Odyssey, that many players criticize Odyssey for its grindy progression system, where their main story is locked behind a level and players have to do side quests which takes hours to do. I do not want to sound like it's by far the best progression system out there. I'm sure there are other RPG games that do it very well, but it all comes to executing it properly. But it's far better to have a progression system that doesn't consistently block you from the main story, as that's something Ubisoft intended when they announced it. That's pretty much all I have to say, so we'll continue with stealth. The Hidden Blade returned to Assassin's Creed, and you can now insta-kill enemies, except you have to unlock a specific skill in order to insta-kill enemies, which is by doing a QTE. Depending on the level, weaker enemies will have a bigger window to perform a stealth kill, while stronger enemies like the mini-bosses have a smaller window. While stealth isn't deep, it's pretty much functional and detection rate is actually reasonable. Well, if you set the difficulty to normal difficulty. I wanted to try the stealth in Master Assassin, but the moment you've been seen, it is an instant detection, which was really annoying to deal with that I had to switch back to normal. Getting detected isn't that punishing since it doesn't suffer from the anyone knows where you are like Watch Dogs do. However, it's mostly talking about the base stealth in general, not too deep, but it's good in general. But what I do have an issue is the lack of utilization of social stealth, which is non-existent. It's close to level of the first Assassin's Creed social stealth. When tailing someone, you're better off just jumping buildings to building in London, but when you're in Jorvik, it feels kinda scripted. It mostly feels underutilized to even underwhelming to say the least. I understand that Eivor is a brutal Viking and stealth isn't his memo, but if you're gonna introduce social stealth, at least make it seem like have a good reason why it's there, rather than just having it there just for the sake of pleasing the fans. It's kinda the equivalent of a restaurant announcing that there will be fresh homemade New York style pizza to later arrive at the restaurant and get a bite-sized pizza heated in the microwave. Overall, I don't think stealth is by far impressive or groundbreaking. It's decent, but I had slightly more fun with combat than stealth in general. I had a lot of fun exploring England, and it is indeed a beautiful place. And I do enjoy hearing Vikings chanting while following the river on a boat and going through the vast landscape on horseback. This map is really huge, yet slightly smaller than Odyssey. I do like how there's an autopilot where you don't have to do all the traversing, however, it's not always consistent. Sometimes the route doesn't recognize the bridge that you have to cross the bridge in order to continue your destination. I also need to mention that all the gameplay footage that I have shown and provided are before and during 1.04, so some of the things I will mention might be patched. For example, when traversing through horseback, you might be detected by wolves, bandits, or maybe Anglo-Saxons, which will decrease your horse speed, which makes it annoying to get away from combat. But in recent patches, your horse will no longer slow down when you have been detected, which is a good improvement. Parkour is still somewhat the same as previous titles, and Eivor doesn't feel heavy when performing parkour, but I'm personally not a fan of how strict it is. Syndicate may have the most strictest parkour in the franchise, but some of the fundamentals don't meet, like wall jumping. As you can see right here, you can clearly see that Eivor can easily grab the ladder, but the game just won't let him, which is pretty disappointing. I know a lot of people aren't a huge fan of the Ezio Trilogy parkour system, mostly because they suck at video games. But given that they have accessibility features in the game like instant assassination, turning off gore and decapitation, nudity, to even change the difficulty at any time in the game, but how come there isn't an option for experienced players to have a manual mode in the parkour system? Isn't that the point of parkour, having the freedom to approach a destination as creative and stylish as possible? And I'm not asking for Eivor to do flashy parkour, I just want basic controls because I find it quite boring that you cannot let go of the wall and do a fast fall. Wall ejects are kind of a hit or miss, as sometimes Eivor will just grab the ledge and sometimes stand on the ledge. Free running parkour is pretty good in a way. I still think Unity's parkour is by far the best parkour system in the game, not only because of the flashy animations or the freedom of the parkour, but it gives camera control when performing free running. You don't have to hold X to continue jumping on the platform, as you can just hold R2 and have camera control so you can have more view on where you want to land on. But when you're sprinting, Eivor just gets off the platform because I didn't hold the X button to jump, so I have to stop, fix my camera angle, and continue with jumping onto the next platform. However, if you did not know this, you can actually play Valhalla with your mouse and keyboard, which makes parkour way easier to do. I really wish developers have this type of accessibility for players, because sometimes playing with mouse and keyboard is a really good thing to play with. That's pretty much everything I have to say at this point. Side content does complement the exploration, and it does give more depth to the world. Cursed locations where you find the charm and destroy it, only to discover the reason behind why it's cursed. Discovering the hidden one's secret hideout and learn more about their true origins. And looking for the 3 blades in which you have to battle 3 witches to fight and unlock a cool armor. I've literally spent 60 hours doing just side content, and the main story is exactly 60 hours long, which we'll get into that later. There is another type of side quests, well, they are called world events, which are really short mini quests that only takes about less than 2 minutes to finish them, which is pretty nice. However, what's new to me is that there is no indicator that points where and what to do, which is pretty unique unlike other RPG games. You actually have to listen to dialogue if you want to finish a world event. A good portion are straightforward, but some left me really confused that I honestly wish that there were at least an indicator or a hint. Given that the game was kinda buggy, it's really hard to know if you're bound to to be softlogging an activity that you have to reload your save file. Flighting in this game, or Viking rap battle, is a pretty cool feature. It's not something like drinking contest or a board game, but it's actually beneficial when you're doing main mission, as they could help you evade battles or pay huge prizes. I do often find myself talking away out of trouble, which is a pretty awesome thing to do. However, it's not completely deep as other RPG titles like Skyrim, where speech can actually help you through dialogue, negotiating prices when you visit town or villages. Would honestly like to see more depth when it comes to stuff like this. For instance, Eivor can listen to rumors about the seller or information about the market that he can use to negotiate prices that adds more depth to the world of England. And if you expect that merchants would be diverse in their stocks, sell different kinds of armor, materials, and cosmetics and etc., trust me, it's not worth the hype. Raiding Monastery is honestly really fun. On presentation, it might sound repetitive, but the monasteries doesn't feel the same. What's more awesome is that you have the choice to infiltrate a monastery, either stealth your way in or just go guns blazing. You can also hunt legendary animals, which are technically bosses, but I felt like it wasn't really worth doing them. There's so much stuff to talk about the side content that this game has to offer, but I fear that the video is already long enough as it is to talk about it. I think it's sometimes best to not spoil that much and let the player first experience the activities around the world of England. In this part of the video, I'm going to be harsh in this section because I honestly believe it's by far the most underwhelming part of this game. There are some stuff that I did not bring or clarify in combat, which is character customizations, but they are mostly related to stats and skill tree, but I'm mostly going to specify it as personalization. I did mention before that I did not play Odyssey or Origins, but I do know that Odyssey has levels of customizations where you are allowed to wear a certain armor without affecting the stats. The closest thing that you can get is hiding the armor, but it just leaves Eivor being shirtless to even naked. However, you don't necessarily have to worry about getting new armor, as it doesn't suffer from the weakest armor in the game is now powerful than the legendary armor. I honestly really like the armor in this game, but what drew me off from upgrading is the lack of materials. Every single armor that you get is upgradable with leather and iron, which is kind of boring as it just inflates the material. The only way to earn them is by buying them on the merchants, looting, finding ores around mountains and cliff, and hunting. There is really no depth when it comes to upgrading your gear. In Witcher 3, when you want a cool looking armor, you actually need to gather a specific material or loot in a specific area that gives a sense of uniqueness to the armor. I imagine most people will not mind these kinds of upgrades, but for me, I find it quite dumbfounded how I have a lot of items on my inventory that their only purpose is to resell them. You can trade animal body parts, but it's just time consuming and the reward is not even worth it. I can somewhat forgive the market system in this game, and it's alright if you don't think about it too much. Ravensthorpe, on the other hand, is by far the most underwhelming, no, not even underwhelming, just underdeveloped and unrefined. There could have been so many things that would have made Ravensthorpe an interesting part of Valhalla, and a game that has no in-game market economy, it's honestly disappointing. When raiding a monastery, the only thing you'll do is three things: invade, loot, and leave. That's it. You do not claim the territory or even do anything with it. The only reason you're doing it is to build houses that gives you a small buff that roughly changes anything. Hiring Jumps Viking is also pretty pointless, as they do not add anything to your Viking crew and you cannot really send them to secret missions like other Assassin's Creed titles. So there really is no way to earn a passive income in this game, and there's absolutely no stakes or risk when raiding high level monasteries. I did mention that you have the choice to approach a monastery by either stealth or combat, but there isn't really a main factor that influences that decision. It's either you do it because you prefer stealth over combat and vice versa, and the only factor that you could influence that decision is simply that they are high level enemies and you can cheese your way by doing stealth. But you never consider throughout your playthrough, are my Vikings strong enough to raid this monastery? Because there is no risk or stakes here. The closest you'll get is one of your demon soul leading Vikings that you just hired in London is injured, you just revive him and he's back to fighting like no problem. Don't think that this is new or too ambitious to be implemented. This is something that Ubisoft did with the Brotherhood, and that game came out a decade ago. It's kinda odd how a company that claims they focus a lot in historical accuracy, while some it is indeed quite accurate, for instance LGBT in Norse culture. But there are two types of romance in this game, either story-related or Ravensthorpe-related. Story-related romance are mostly a one-time thing, while Ravensthorpe is doing a commitment to the character you're dating, which is kind of odd since according to historians that study Vikings and Norse culture claim that Vikings were more polyamorous. And what's more odd is that the story-based characters that you can sort of romance with are more fleshed out than the ones in Ravensthorpe, except for Ramby, but that would contain spoilers.
Have drifted back to you daily.
I care for you as well, Topin. You speak words that I have often said myself.
You mean that?
You and I are so alike in our nature, but you temper the flames that burn in me. That comforts me.
In you, I see the fighter I once was. Yet your aims are noble, honest. I cannot look away. May I kiss you?
This might be a hot take, but I honestly believe that Valhalla's story is by far the best story in the series. Now, there are 4 stories to be told here: Eivor, Layla, Asgard, and the Ancient Order story, which isn't really a huge part of the story, but it does play a role in the end. As I again mentioned, I have not played Origins or Odyssey, so I cannot say a lot about Layla other than she worked for Abstergo and now she's working with the Assassin to stop a second world ending happening. I cannot really say much about it. The Asgard story is Eivor taking an acid trip to Asgard as he plays a role of Odin or Havi. While the Norse mythology like Thor, Rhea, Loki, and Odin are interesting characters, they don't really compensate for the boringness of this mission. I would have appreciated more if it was more linear driven like other Assassin's Creed game, instead of Asgard and Jotunheim being an open world map. It just feels kinda pointless to do side content as their only reward is just XP point and that's it. At first it might feel completely pointless halfway, which kinda does until you get to the ending of the main story, which was a major plot twist that 3 stories just tangle each other. I honestly don't feel like I want to summarize Asgard's story, mostly because I just don't care, but I'll summarize it in one sentence. Odin doesn't want to die in Ragnarok and the only solution is to be reincarnated. That's it. Oh, and Basim is Loki, and you get to play as him when you finish Layla's story. Yeah, I'm not actually joking here. The Ancient Order story is pretty cool from the first experience until you realize that the Ancient Order is just a reskin of the Hidden Cosmos. But wait a minute, Crone, you said you haven't played Odyssey, so how come you know? Let's just say someone told me about it. Zealots are by far the most annoying enemies to deal with as you cannot assassinate them. Not to mention that the awful bugs that this game has, but the members are in general are pretty interesting while some are just boring. I honestly had a lot of fun eliminating the Ancient Orders, but the leading group that are in the same ranks as Fulke are the most uninteresting to even boring characters out there. All these guys do is just chill in a village doing absolutely nothing, asking to be killed while their goons do all the dirty work. That didn't make a lot of sense to me, but whatever. Now that I mentioned my displeasure with the things I've mentioned, but now I'm going to talk about my favorite part of the game, which is Eivor's story. I honestly do believe that Eivor's story is by far the best narrative-driven story in the Assassin's Creed franchise, and Ubisoft did a good job. Given that Eivor is a somewhat reincarnation of Odin, he will be your guide throughout the story, but some of his beliefs and decisions are rather questionable that makes Eivor question if he should follow his path or not. For instance, when you discover that Eivor the Boneless killed Shelbert just for the sake of wanting to murder Rodri, he purposely manipulated you and your allies to invade his castle. But once you defeat him, Eivor wants you to give him the axe so he can go to Valhalla. Odin steps in and wants you to give him the axe because he is a true fighter. Obviously, I refuse and send him to Helheim. Another part is Dag. While Dag is a dumbass character that doesn't even want to acknowledge throughout your journey that you have contributed more to the Raven clan than Sigurd, he doesn't believe in your leadership and role that he challenges you to a duel. Once you defeat him, Odin steps in to say, oh, you should send him to Helheim for disrespecting your leadership. At this this point, I realized that he was just a war fetishist, that throughout the beginning to the end, I did the opposite of what he wanted. While he may be an annoying or a dislikable character to some, he does play a role on Eivor's development throughout the story, and I personally love how he was a factor on developing Eivor's arc. My favorite part was when you enter Valhalla, or a simulation of Valhalla, that you convince Sigurd that this isn't real and just fantasy. However, Odin steps in and stops you from escaping the simulation and fights against you. You cannot deal damage to him, but there is a gate where your friends are signaling you to escape. If you decide to escape, Odin will literally drag you with your axe and continue fighting him. And I really love how the only way you defeat him is by unequipping your axe from your inventory and run your way to the gate. That way, Odin cannot force you to fight him, which is honestly the most creative boss fight I've ever seen in Assassin's Creed franchise, and it just gives this satisfying arc.
A true warrior. Take off your axe! Coward of cowards! Becca's bastard! Stand and face me, you feeble-armed thrall! Leave me now. You are nothing. With me, have wisdom, glory, power. What more do you need? Everything else. No!
As much as I do enjoy this moment a lot, I am worried that regardless if I choose the path or not, it will lead to the same outcome. The only difference in terms of outcome would be between you and Sigurd if he should stay in Norway or leave with you to England, as he would use your actions to determine if he would stay or not. The only circumstances he wanted to stay was because I stole his father's resources, punched him in the face, and defied him. But I did manage to convince him to come to England, and it was quite satisfying result. And I personally like how it starts out when you are told to betray Sigurd, and throughout your journey you kinda did it subconsciously because it left the impression at some point you have to make the decision that you have to be fully against him. I find it really clever as you connect more with Eivor, because Sigurd has a great introduction and then you are told to betray him, which leaves the Eivor and the player the impression of why should I betray him? Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Alliance arc. The biggest critique I have heard is that the story is way too long and you're gonna be spending most of the main story in building an alliance. For me, I really love long stories and I do love the fact that it utilizes every region of the map. However, I do understand why some shouldn't really be an obligation, as it really feels kinda optional. At times it does feel rather time consuming, but at least it compensates by representing interesting characters. If you want to rush the game and finish the main story from start to finish with no side quests, it would take you approximately 60 hours to complete. And if you were to remove the filler alliance, it would pretty much make the main story like 50-hour long playthrough at best. At the end of the day, it's still a good story. Some people didn't like the ending because it literally doesn't have the endgame credit. I would say this mostly applies to Layla's story, which technically is her last present in the game, but Eivor's story feels concluded and left me feeling satisfied. I mean, just think about it. You went with Sigurd to England to help him be a Jarl by making an alliance. You contributed more to Ravensword, helped the Hidden Ones more than Sigurd, accomplished making every part of England your ally, and convinced Sigurd to stay in England, and he comes and say, you know what, you deserve it, you're more qualified to be a Jarl. Hell yeah, I'm qualified to be a Jarl, thank you very much. That's pretty much everything I have to say about Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and there's so much stuff to talk about that I haven't even mentioned with the controversial Helix store. The only thing I have to say is I don't really care about the microtransaction, and I never feel obligated to spend money on cosmetics. I know a lot of people don't like it, but that would be a video for another time. So what do I think of Assassin's Creed Valhalla? I think it's a pretty good game and I really highly recommend to give it a try. However, if you're interested in being in a franchise, I don't think this is the game for beginners, and certainly not for everyone. But if you like Viking shenanigans and do not care about the present day story, this is the game for you. I give Assassin's Creed Valhalla an A+.